now. All right. Rewind. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the pilot episode of the 2022 World War II lecture series brought to you by the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation and Filipino-American Memorial Endowment, or FAME. So for tonight's episode, we'll be Dr. Jose will be talking about World War II history in the Philippines, how it started, the 3 long years of the Japanese occupation and our eventual liberation. Sorry, am I clear now? Okay. All right. Okay, sorry. I was just so excited that you can hear me now. So we just like to take a brief moment now to dedicate tonight's program in memory of Mr. Roderick McMicking Hall, a great advocate of Philippine World War II history. He passed away peacefully 3 days ago. And as a boy, he lived through the Japanese occupation, and several of his family members died during the Battle of Manila. He became an advocate of Philippine World War II history and became one of the founders of Memorare Manila. He has an extensive collection of World War II books and sources, which is housed at the Filipinas Heritage Library at the Ayala Museum. Rest in peace, Tito Rod, and I know that you're happy we're doing this lecture series now. So without further ado, let us now proceed to our program proper. So for those of you who would like to type in questions or comments, you can just type it in the comment box and we'll try our very best to answer it later during the Q&A. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Rico Jose is a professor of history at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. He obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in history at UP and his Ph.D. from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He specializes in military and diplomatic history with focus on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. Among his major publications are the Philippine Army, 1935 to 1942, the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, Volume 7 of the Kasaysayan multi-volume series published by the Reader's Digest in 1998. And together with his dissertation advisor, Setsuho Ikehata, Dr. Jose co-edited the pioneering book, The Philippines Under Japan, Occupation, Policy, and Reaction. This is the first time a thorough study was made using Japanese primary sources. Dr. Jose is a much sought-after speaker on Philippine war and military history, and he has delivered papers and lectures in numerous conferences here and abroad. In 1997, he was awarded Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of social sciences in 1997, the first historian to be given this recognition. Twice, he received UP Diliman's Gawad Chancellor Award para sa natatanging guro in 2011 and 2018, and the Batobalani Many Faces of a Teacher Award in 2018. He was also awarded the Metrobank Foundation's Outstanding Filipino in Teaching in 2019. He is the Chief Historical Advisor of the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation and member of the Board of Directors of Memorare Manila and FAME. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that we bring to you tonight the demigod of Philippine World War II history, my good friend and mentor, Dr. Rico Jose. Sir Rico, your mic.
Okay, so good evening to all of you. Minasang konbanwa. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. I have greeted you in the 3 languages that we can greet each other today in those 3 languages. But 80 years ago exactly, we could not do the same thing because we were under enemy occupation. So we are doing this to commemorate 80 years of since the Second World War in the Philippines. And this particular month is quite important because many things happened during this particular month. Now, I'm going to try to give an overview of the war in the Philippines. It's a very big topic, and I do have one graduate course just on this, one whole semester on this. So let me share my screen at this point and go into our slide presentation. So 80 years ago, today, the world faces an unprecedented crisis. We're all familiar with what's going on right now, the difficulties we face. But exactly 80 years ago, the world was locked in global conflict, World War II. In fact, right now, the Philippines was in that cataclysmic event. It was not a medical event as we have today, but it was a world war. And in fact, in January 1942, Manila had just been occupied by the Japanese military forces, as were several other key cities and towns. Baguio was occupied, Davao was occupied, Vigan, many other cities and towns were occupied by this time also. The defense of Bataan and Corregidor had just begun. In fact, this would mark the second week, more or less, of the beginning of the campaign in Bataan. So this was just the beginning of 3.5 years of pain and suffering. But also, with that, we had courage and hope. And so how and why did the Philippines get involved in the war? The war is always a complicated thing to look into. But if you look in the Philippines, we look at the Philippines was and still is in the center of Southeast Asia. So our position is strategic. We're very right in the center of things right here. And we are also very rich in natural resources. And the Great Depression in the 1930s had led to the rise of fascism and militarism in Germany, in Italy, and in particular Japan. And Japan had very strong interests in this region. And the United States' presence in the Philippines tended to challenge Japanese expansion. So all of this was very complicated. When you look at the Philippines in the period just before the war, people will still remember that this was a period where the Philippines had a very lot of promise. The Philippines was looking towards a very prosperous future, but the war intervened. And so when we look into this, the Philippines was, by the time the war started, not yet independent. We were still an American colony, but we were already on the road to independence. Already independence had been promised in 1946, and a 10-year transition period had been set, which was called the Philippine Commonwealth. And one of the first priorities of the Philippine Commonwealth government was the preparation of the Philippines for national defense. This was a very important topic to President Quezon at that time. So much so that the National Defense Act, which is still functioning today, was the first act actually passed by the Philippine Commonwealth. So we were preparing to defend ourselves. We were building up an army. We were building up a conscript system. We were building up a military training system, which involved high school students, college students, and those 21 years old and above. Now, in the 1930s, there was a fear that Japan might eventually try to take over the Philippines, if not militarily, then economically. But at that time, very few people took that seriously. We had friendly relations with Japan. And in fact, at that point, since there had not yet been a world war, we were not involved in the war, we looked towards Japan as a source of cheap goods, tourist destination, and so forth. But to the others, Americans and to Filipinos in the defense system, they saw that the Japanese might eventually decide to take over the Philippines at one point. In fact, one can go into this and discuss this very, very much in depth. As early as 1905, 1906, the Americans were already looking at a possible Japanese invasion of the Philippines. And if you look at it from the Japanese point of view, the Japanese would in fact also be developing plans to invade the Philippines fairly early on. But the Commonwealth was hoping to look into neutrality, that we could stay out of war. And by playing both sides, being friends with the Japanese and the United States, maybe we might get out of the war. And before the war, of course, Manila was a cosmopolitan city. It was very clean. The population was much smaller than it is today. It looked very prosperous. And insofar as the Philippine Army, there was no Philippine Air Force and no Philippine Navy yet. It was all one service, the Philippine Army, that was also training pilots, the Philippine Army Air Corps. Here we have some of the pilots and one of the training planes. We were testing out what was called the Philippine Army Offshore Patrol, and we had one boat that we took in from Britain. We ordered from Britain. We were supposed to have several more of these, and there were about 8 more under construction when the war started. So we were preparing for defense. This was an army simply for defense. These are Philippine Army troops who were training with a large gun, a 155 millimeter gun in Pampanga. And even women were slowly being involved in the defense preparations as well. So this was something that included everyone. Those who were not in the military would be involved in civil service. There was something called the Civilian Emergency Administration, and the whole thing was preparing for just in case things might run out of control. Now, by the late 1930s, it had become obvious that Japan was bent on expanding its interests in Asia, partly because they suffered because of the Great Depression, so they had economic problems, and one solution to this was to conquer territory in mainland Asia to be able to acquire raw materials, and this moved them to take over Manchuria in 1931. 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war against China without actually declaring war on the Chinese, and that would be extremely painful to the Chinese. They still remember it very much today, and many lives were lost because of this undeclared war. By the 1940s, Japan was now proclaiming a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Asia for the Asiatics, and that they would drive these white colonizers out of Asia altogether. But that did not dampen their experience of continuing war against the Chinese. Now, by 1940 also, you would have the Japanese allying themselves with Italy and Germany in the so-called Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis, the tripartite pact. So this meant that if a war would break out, then it would involve all three powers. Europe and Asia would be involved in a war. We would have a world war. And while the United States was especially wary of Japan's expansion in China, they tried various means, moral, they tried economic sanctions and so forth. And Japan decided to continue the war in the face of American sanctions. Rather than pulling back and stopping the war in China, they continued to pull through. And when the Americans began to push further on economic sanctions on the Japanese decided to move into southern Indochina first, and then from there they would move into Southeast Asia, which would now provide them with the oil, rubber, tin, and other materials that they needed. So in July 1941, this is a turning point in a sense, because the Japanese moved their forces into what's now Vietnam, but at that time this was still French Indochina. So when that was done, the Japanese were looking towards acquiring all of these resources in Southeast Asia. This is a map that shows before the war what the Japanese were looking at. And the Philippines, as you can see, had a number of raw materials that the Japanese needed for their war effort. And because they were convinced that eventually they would invade the Philippines, there was quite a great deal of pre-war intelligence going on. Some Japanese airliners were actually flying over northern Luzon and taking photographs. This is what the map shows. Others were being hired in the Philippines to report on the depth of the sea. Fishermen were looking into ship movements and so forth. The Americans, realizing that they would eventually wind up fighting the Japanese at one point or the other, had developed something that they called War Plan Orange 3, just in case they would have a war between Japan and the United States. This would mean the Philippines would be at the front line of this war. And the basic idea of this plan was that Bataan and Corregidor would be held and await American reinforcements from the mainland or from Hawaii. By 1941, this war plan had expanded to become what became known as War Plan Rainbow 5, which now meant a global war, not just in the Pacific, not just against Japan, but one that would include a war in Europe. That was War Plan Rainbow 5. And this included now the Philippine Army, which would be mobilized, the reserves would be mobilized and made part of the U.S. Army. So there would be preparations for war. The U.S. and U.S. Navy and even the Army, in fact, would realize that war was coming to the Philippines, and the U.S. Navy in particular would send the dependents, the families, the wives, the children of sailors and naval officers to the United States. U.S. Army did so much later on. President Roosevelt, we have a lot of news about this now because Roosevelt Avenue is being changed, the name is being changed. Roosevelt was the president of the US at this time. He proclaimed a state of national emergency, which included the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, the government, being aware that a war might eventually take place also, would pass laws punishing spies, controlling shipping movements, and creating what became known as the Civilian Emergency Administration. The final straw for the United States was Japan's moving its military forces to southern Indochina. And that was the last straw that President Roosevelt would take. And after that, he froze Japanese assets, declared an oil embargo. He prevented the shipment of oil from the US to Japan, which left Japan short of oil. And he also created the USAFE, or the US Army Forces in the Far East. MacArthur was placed in command of the USAFE, and the Philippine Army Reserves were ordered mobilized. MacArthur sent very promising reports on the mobilization effort, how successful he was, his defense plan was going on, and he persuaded Washington, D.C. to change its mind from the old defend Bataan Corregidor thing to defend the whole Philippines, send all the modern equipment to the Philippines, and he would be able to defend it. There was a very strict timetable. September was when the first big reinforcements started to come in. And under the timetable MacArthur had, he would be ready for war by March of 1942. As we know, the Japanese didn't wait for March. They knew that the timetable was there, and the war started in December. Ironically, while there was this change of mind insofar as the Army was concerned, the U.S. Navy was left out of this entirely. And the U.S. Navy, in particular the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines, was not bent on defending the Philippines. They were supposed to pull southwards. In any case, the preparations for war began to take place by September 1941. Philippine reservists were coming in, reporting to service to the United States Army Forces in the Far East, as shown here. And then you would have the most modern American bombers arriving in the Philippines. This is one of them, the B17 Bomber. This was extremely important. It was a strategic weapon that could bomb Taiwan, which was in Japanese hands at that time. It could also reach as far as southern Japan. So this was a strategic weapon. Based in the Philippines, this could now prevent the Japanese from expanding into Southeast Asia. The Japanese knew that very well. And so as these B-17 bombers started to come in, more were on the way when the war actually started. The Americans also sent their most modern tanks. These are some of them that were arriving in the piers. They had arrived and were being put together, and they would see much action in the defense of the Philippines. You would have other modern aircraft coming in, and even the very modern M1 Garand rifle was starting to come in. Even the early form of Jeep, the early models of the Jeep were starting to come to the Philippines as well. So there was definitely preparation for war. This is the 41st Division mobilizing in Tagaytay. This was General Lim's division. It would fight very stubbornly in Bataan and make a name for itself. So there was preparation for war, but most other people felt that this was not to be taken seriously. This was just going to deter the Japanese. The Japanese were afraid of all of this. They would not attack because the Americans were simply too strong. So when the Japanese did start the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7 in Pearl Harbor, but December 8 in the Philippines, you would have that as a very great surprise to the Philippines. After Pearl Harbor was attacked, very quickly, the same day, that's December 8, Davao was attacked, Baguio was attacked, and by noontime, Clark Field was attacked as well. Nobody could predict that the Japanese could do this all at the same time. And the initial Philippine response was very patriotic, very nationalistic. The Philippines must be defended. And so this is the first week of war. This is what the Philippines Free Press put out in its editorial, linking the cry of Balintawak to the present state in the Philippines, December 1941, that everyone should rush to the defense of the Philippines. So people made a beeline for the Philippine Army recruiting offices. But at the same time as that was going on, Clark Field had been bombed. Manila itself was bombed within 24 hours, very early in the morning of December 9. Cavite was bombed in full view of the people in Manila. They saw the bombers fly over Cavite and they saw it burn as it is here. And that resulted in the destruction of the major U.S. Army, Air Force, and U.S. Navy bases in the Philippines. So, first day of the war, most of the American air power was destroyed. And by December 10, you would have the major repair facilities of the U.S. Navy also destroyed. So MacArthur's plan had been to hold the beaches, put the soldiers in strategic beaches, and block the Japanese there. Who were the soldiers who were at the beaches? Most of them were Filipinos. They were reservists, not professional soldiers. Most of them were about 24 to 25 years of age. Many young volunteers, college students, even teenagers volunteered, some of them even children. Some Katipuneros even tried to volunteer, but they were eventually sent back home. Now, American units were also part of the USAFE. There was one infantry regiment in Manila. It was the main all U.S. force here in the Philippines. That was also put on alert right away. And of course, the Army Air Force units, now many of them without planes, would have to fight as infantrymen. So defense of country was a very big big driving force for many Filipinos. Many volunteered to join the army. This was taking place at the height of Christmas, 1941. So you had ads like this coming out in the newspapers that the war is really a war to fight for the Philippine identity, for the Philippine traditions, and so forth. In many cases, the fighting was one-sided. The Philippine Army Air Corps had old-fashioned aircraft like this, a P-26 fighter plane, fighting against very modern Japanese fighter planes. But even with the odds like this against him, Villamor was able to shoot down one or two Japanese planes. However, this type of thing could not be kept up. And while the beaches were lined with guns like this, the Japanese had battleships, they had control of the seas, they had control of the air, and these beach defenses were quickly pushed back because they were overwhelmed by the Japanese landing forces. The Japanese landed in places where they were not expected, and pretty soon General Homa himself was on Philippine shores. In many cases, there was gallant fighting that took place. Northern Luzon, this is in Pangasinan, you have cavalry troops of the very famous Philippine Scouts, 26th Cavalry Philippine Scouts, moving towards the front, which is just north, just a few kilometers north of this picture. Some of the cavalrymen here would not return alive. Their horses would start running back after some time, but the riders would have been killed. But many of them died very gloriously, fighting to the best of their ability. One tank is here trying to cover them, but the tanks were just too few at that point. Manila was bombed in due course, and many of the important buildings in Intramuros were hit by the Japanese, and this really showed Filipinos that this was really what war was like. And for many Filipinos, this was the first time they had seen something like this. Many of them tried to escape to the provinces. The English word evacuate was made more local, bakwet. So the word that we use today is a World War II coined word. This is what Tutuban Station looked like at the height of the attempt to get out of Manila. So as the front lines collapsed from the beach areas, then MacArthur would have to declare War Plan Orange back into operation, and everyone, all the armed forces in Manila, in Luzon, would have to go to Bataan and Corregidor and hold there for as long as possible, hoping that reinforcements would come from the United States. Those reinforcements would not be coming in because, as we know, Pearl Harbor was hit very heavily, and already Manila was itself being bombed MacArthur had lost most of his air force on the first day of the war. So the fighting would eventually focus on ground warfare. The Japanese would control the seas and the air. Manila had to be declared an open city. The government had to evacuate to Corregidor, and whatever the Japanese would be able to use was put with the torch. A lot of cases of heroism took place in the withdrawal to Bataan, places like Pangasinan, Tarlac, and Pampanga. We even have medals of honor being won very early on at this stage. To save Manila from further destruction, Manila was declared an open city, as we see here. And we see the importance of Bataan and Corregidor. Bataan and Corregidor together prevented the Japanese from using strategic Manila Bay. While they may have taken Manila very early on, they could not use the port facilities as long as Bataan and Corregidor were in Filipino and American hands. So there was a fighting retreat. Bridges were blown up like this one in Batangas. And even with the bridges blown, however, the Japanese managed to advance, forcing banqueros to help them cross or crossing the ruins of the bridges themselves. This is one of the pictures from the withdrawal. This is one of those M3 tanks moving into Bataan. And the Bataan campaign was marked by essentially a World War I type battle where you have fixed lines of defense, the Abukay line and so forth. And the Philippine forces in the front line basically were able to stop them initially. And General Lim's 41st Division was particularly famous here because they stopped the Japanese from penetrating that front line. The Japanese eventually crossed using a gap in the mountains, in the forested mountain areas, and that forced the USAFE to go into the second line, which was the final line, which was now intact, and the Japanese tried to outflank it, but they were defeated. So there were quite a number of initial victories for the Filipino-American forces, and the Filipinos showed that they could fight despite the limitations of old weapons, misfiring ammunition, and so forth. The Japanese were shamed by what was happening in Bataan and Corregidor because they were winning in all other fronts. It was only in Bataan and Corregidor that they were unable to meet their timetable. So this is what the fixed lines looked like. American trench soldiers in a trench in Bataan. And Bataan held for 3 months. And the voice of freedom on Corregidor told those in Bataan and those even in occupied Manila and the world that they were still fighting on. So there were victories, and the majority of those in Bataan were Filipinos, either Philippine Army or Philippine Scouts. And they countered the Japanese propaganda using their own counter-propaganda, such as, remember, Erlinda, which was the name of a girl who was found supposedly raped by the Japanese, and she became the symbol of the Philippines being raped, and that she tended to typify Filipino women under the Japanese. So there were heroes aplenty in Bataan, not only in fighting, but also in going beyond the front line to find food. These are some Philippine scouts celebrating a victory over the Japanese with recovered weapons from the Japanese. This was Japanese propaganda that they tried to win over to say that peace had returned, that the Japanese enemy was really the Americans, not the Filipinos. But Filipinos knew better than this, and they came up with Filipinos who were captured by the Japanese and who had been killed in the rear lines. So this is a replica of one of the armored vehicles in Bataan with the slogan, "Remember Erlinda here." This became the fighting slogan for most of the Filipinos in Bataan. These are American soldiers listening to the voice of freedom, which was supposed to give them hope and help build up their morale. And there would also be heroes in the hospitals, doctors and nurses, both American and Filipino. There would be intelligence agents, Filipinos going behind Japanese lines. And there would be blockade runners from Mindanao and from the Visayas to bring food and other assistance to Bataan and Corregidor. Other places fell very quickly, Hong Kong, Singapore, Java, and others, but the defenders continued to fight on, although there was a severe lack of medicine and food. So by the end of the campaign, most of the defenders were hungry and sick. No reinforcements came, and many were very tired. So this shows some of the wounded in Bataan at that time. They could not fit in the hospital anymore, so they were left in their cots outside. And Quezon by this time would try to egg the Americans onwards by trying to convince them to declare independence early and declare the Philippines neutral. But this was impractical at that time. And in the end, MacArthur and Quezon were evacuated to Australia from Corregidor. The Commonwealth government in exile was established, eventually in Washington, D.C. So this is Quezon and Mrs. MacArthur, Mrs. Quezon, and MacArthur's son and Quezon's daughter in Corregidor. The Japanese, however, would receive reinforcements. Some came from China, some from Singapore, some from Japan. Fresh, experienced veteran units. They also had more air cover coming in and support from the sea and more supplies coming in. And the Japanese launched their final offensive on Good Friday in 1942. That's April 3. Target was Mount Samat. And eventually the lines collapsed. The men were hungry, they were tired, they were sick. The Japanese had everything on their side, the tanks, artillery, air support, ships. We had virtually nothing left by that time. And so Bataan surrendered on April 9. These are some of the Japanese bombers that flew against Bataan. We had nothing to fight against them by this time. These were Japanese artillery pieces. We had very limited ammunition also to fight back at that time. And in the end, General King, the commander of the forces on Luzon, would have to surrender to the Japanese. April 9, 1942. That would begin the death march from Bataan to San Fernando, in a train to Capas and so forth. We will have a speaker who will talk on that in more detail later on. Some 10,000 are estimated to have died or were missing on the Philippine side. And despite the tragedy of the march, there also was heroism in the march because you had some Filipinos trying to keep up the morale of their other fellow marchers, others trying to feed them or giving water, particularly civilians up further in the northern part of the march, risking Japanese anger by giving water and food to the death marchers. When Bataan fell, the whole Philippines was affected because the soldiers in Bataan did not only come from Luzon. Some of them came from the Visayas. There were a few from Mindanao, and they came from all over Luzon. So to some, the fall of Bataan was like a second Good Friday. So April 3 was the first Good Friday. April 9 was like a second Good Friday for some. By the time Bataan fell, this meant that the hopes of an early victory against Japan were gone. And while Corregidor and parts of the Visayas and Mindanao still stood, it was now becoming apparent that no reinforcements were coming, and the surrender of Corregidor eventually came in and on May 1942. And after that came orders to surrender the rest of the organized forces in the Visayas and Mindanao. That meant the end of organized warfare in the Philippines, but that bred a guerrilla resistance movement which kept up the fight. And even as the fighting in Bataan and Corregidor was going on, units that had been isolated, that had been cut off in northern Luzon, in the Bicol area, and elsewhere, had mobilized and organized themselves to fight a guerrilla war against the Japanese. So these are pictures of the death march. Again, there is going to be a more detailed discussion of this by another speaker later on. This particular artwork shows some of the unsung Filipino heroes of that time, the civilians in the train stations who tried to toss food and water to the prisoners of war in the train. So Bataan was very symbolic. We're probably familiar with the very famous Bataan has fallen announcement written by Salvador P. Lopez, where he said, Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all the liberty-loving peoples of the world, cannot fail. In fact, Bataan was not an inspiration only to the Philippines, but it did inspire the United States. Other allied areas like Malta and even United Kingdom were inspired by what was happening here. So Corregidor held out for one more month, but surrendered on May 6. So the Japanese captured Corregidor, and again, that meant the end of organized resistance in the Philippines. That meant the Japanese occupation would come into full force. Why was the Philippines important to Japan? Basically, one, the Japanese had to neutralize the American bases here because the American bases would block the Japanese attempt to take over resource-rich Southeast Asia. That was one priority there. But even if the military bases were not here, the strategic position of the Philippines was something that had to be secured by the Japanese, because all of the ships that would take the resources from Southeast Asia would have to pass Philippine waters. And so the Philippines had to be taken to secure the supply lines of the Japanese. A third reason was that the Philippines had, as we still have, very important strategic resources, mineral resources, lumber, natural resources. All of these were important to the Japanese war economy, and the Japanese would develop them very quickly as soon as they took over parts of the Philippines. So the Japanese occupation would last from, depending on where one was, in the case of Manila, January 1942, in the case of Bataan Island, way up in the Batanes, the first day of the war. Mindanao parts of Mindanao would remain free of the Japanese until the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. But for the areas under Japanese occupation, you would have a period where you would have direct Japanese rule under the Japanese military administration. The Japanese military administration would create what was called the Philippine Executive Commission to work under it. And Executive Commission, because that was all it was good for actually. It was supposed to carry out the Japanese Army orders. In order to try to win over Philippine loyalty, or to try to win the Philippine assistance and support to the Japanese would use the ploy of declaring the Philippines independent. And on October 14, 1943, they would at least proclaim the Philippines independent. This would be the second Philippine Republic under the 1943 Constitution under President Jose P. Laurel. That was not a puppet government because the Japanese never were able to fully control President Laurel, but the Japanese tried to use whatever strings they could to try to control that government as best they could. Still, Laurel had his own mind, and he would push to make that independence as real as possible during that time. So this is General Homa and a meeting with the head of the Philippine Executive Commission, Jorge B. Vargas. On the right side, we see the Philippine Executive Commission at that time standing in front of what is now the U.S. Embassy. So under the Japanese military administration, the main goals of the Japanese military administration were to restore peace and order, extract strategic resources that were important to the Japanese war economy, and establish a system of self-sufficiency to maintain the occupation troops. That is, the rice that we would produce would feed not only Filipinos, but would also feed the Japanese occupation force. And to try to establish some form of continuity, the Japanese would try to re-establish the executive system and the government system as closely as possible to the pre-war system through the Philippine Executive Commission, with several offices closed. There was, of course, no Department of National Defense. For one, there was no vice president, and so forth. So it was a streamlined system. The Japanese would try to establish a controlled economy because they knew that a free enterprise system would not work. So they created associations of farmers, associations of food producers, vendors, and so forth. Everything was rationed, rice, every food, soap, matches, different parts of the economy were readjusted to fit the Japanese demands. For example, the Japanese didn't need sugar, so they turned the sugar lands to cotton fields instead. The Japanese introduced their own money and banned the circulation of pre-war money. US banks, allied banks were closed and their companies were seized. The Japanese would try to emphasize their own supremacy and introduce their own cultural ways. In doing this, they would have to censor all media, radio, films, theater, all newspapers and magazines were closed until further notice. And when they were reopened, they had to have the censors check everything that came out. The Japanese would also rule by terror, by fear, using the military police or the Kempeitai. So these would become some of the main items that people remember the Japanese occupation for. The fear, the uncertainty, rations, and the Philippine flag and the national anthem were banned. Only the Japanese flag was allowed. Japanese national anthem were allowed initially. And in all public programs, that was preceded by bowing deeply in the direction of the imperial palace. Things that were used in Japan and Korea, occupied China, and Taiwan were introduced here as well. Things like a neighborhood association to keep track of everybody in the occupied areas, who came in, how many people were living in each house, and so forth. All political parties were abolished and replaced by one large service party called the Kapisanan sa Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas, or the Kalibapi. So propaganda pictures of Japanese soldiers on the right side seemingly friendly, but on the left looking stern. This was the Japanese occupation money, which quickly became known as Mickey Mouse money because it did not look real until the second issue, which is in the bottom here, which looked a little more real, but still looked more like play money than anything else. They introduced bowing. Everyone had to bow in front of Japanese sentries or be slapped if they didn't bow properly. The upper photo shows Igorots in the mountain province being introduced to sumo wrestling, no matter how inapplicable that was. And the Japanese would introduce Radyo Taiso, exercises which were dictated by a radio, and they tried to have camps in which Japanese boys and Filipino boys would mix together. So all of these seemed quite friendly. These seemed to be at least bringing the Philippines sense of discipline, order, and trying to bring the Philippines into the Asian fold. Nippongo became a must. Here is a Japanese soldier teaching Nippongo. This was a must course in schools, and even those in government had to take up Nippongo. So many people who did survive the war will remember a few words of Japanese. For the Chinese in the Philippines, the Japanese realized that many of the Chinese here were actually supportive of the Chinese in the mainland who were fighting the Japanese. So they watched the Chinese very closely, organized them into different associations where they could be controlled. And as for the so-called enemy aliens, the Americans and the British and those who were now members of the opposing side, the opposing countries, these aliens, these civilians, were placed in what became known as the internment camp, the biggest one being Santo Tomas internment camp. Now, in order to help win the loyalty of Filipinos, apart from the Declaration of Independence, Filipinos who had been taken prisoners of war in Bataan and Corregidor were eventually released, but not after about 30,000 of them died because of disease, because of malnutrition, or simply because of lack of attention. And so while this was trying to win over the Filipinos, independence plus the release of the prisoners of war, there was also a concerted Japanese counter-guerrilla operations that would try to crush any dissent, any form of resistance against the Japanese. And this is what Santo Tomas internment camp looked like the first few days as the Americans began to report in. And independence in 1943, the Philippine flag was now at last allowed to fly by itself. The Philippine national anthem was played and sung, but not after the words had been sufficiently altered so that some of the nationalistic fervor would be diluted in the 1943 national anthem. The reality was, in spite of all the propaganda that the Japanese were bringing out, the reality was fear, uncertainty, shortages of everything. Fort Santiago became the it became the most feared place in Manila. Other places in the Philippines had their own versions of that. In Davao and Baguio and other cities, they all had their own version of Fort Santiago. This meant untold physical suffering to those who were arrested and suspected of being anti-Japanese. Another form of torture can be seen on the lower right here, where you see 3 suspected thieves being racked together in this ancient Oriental or Asian form of torture. The upper right photograph shows what public transportation began to look like towards the latter part of the Japanese occupation. Severe shortages, not only of transportation, but of all other necessities, including soap, shampoo, and various forms of food. So how did Filipinos respond to all of this? You'd have one form of escape was popular culture. Then, as now, one could escape the realities of the uncertainties of that time by going to the theaters, tuning into radio, trying to listen or watch programs that were out of this world in a sense. And some of them were musicals, some of them were humorous, slapstick, and perhaps one of the most famous couples at that time, or pairs, comedian pairs, was Pugo and Tugo, whom the Japanese knew were popular already before the war, but the names sounded too similar to Japanese heroes' names that they ordered the names to be changed. From Pugo and Tugo, it became Puging and Tuging. And there was what was called the mystery singer. And they actually formed a way, or they discovered a way of providing intelligence or building morale or even undermining Japanese propaganda through the use of jokes or humor. Pugo and Tugo in particular would mimic what the Japanese soldiers were doing in a very humorous manner, causing the audience to laugh. And the Japanese would not be able to understand what was so funny, but the errors of the Japanese soldiers were portrayed in such hilarious forms that at one point Pugo and Tugo would be taken to Fort Santiago to be interrogated too. The mystery singer who would appear on stage, he was very popular before the war, very beautiful voice. He would appear on stage occasionally, and sometimes he would sing a song that would warn the guerrillas inside the audience that there were Japanese spies in the audience, and so you would better get out of the theater quietly and as safely as possible. One of the songs he would sing would be "Bakit Hindi Ka Bumabalik" or "Bakit Hindi Ka Dumarating," which was an implication that MacArthur, asking why MacArthur was not yet coming back. Other forms of humor, and this will allow us to shift into the resistance movement, would be using Philippine words in place of Japanese words, giving a totally opposite meaning. So the Japanese word for long live or mabuhay was banzai. And when the Prime Minister visited Manila in 1943, the crowds began to shout not banzai but bangkai, which meant had a totally different meaning. The Japanese expression for good morning is Ohayo gozaimasu. And some Filipinos in Manila realized that if you added the letter P to it, it changed the meaning again, and it became Ohayo gozaimasu. And some even said that the name Pilipinas had to be changed. It was more accurately Pilipinas, because everything you had to do, you had to line up, you had to make pila, you had to queue. And so that was one thing that allowed us to survive, the humor. Substitutes, then as now, again, we look at resilience, and so on, strong point in the Filipino psyche. Banana ketchup had been discovered just before the war. It had been discovered, but it was popularized during the war, and that's because there was no tomato ketchup in the Philippines at that time. There was also no We didn't have the castañas for Christmas at that time, or we didn't have the nuts for Christmas. So enterprising Filipinos made use of coconut meat, and it became known as castañón. Other things that were not seen as edible before the war were now seen as actually being edible. Among them, cassava and other items. Banana peels were seen as substitutes for shoe polish, and gugo was seen as a good substitute for our own version of shampoo. So this is pugo and tugo in their earlier days. And while that form, using humor against the Japanese, was a form of resistance itself, that was what we might call passive resistance, a lot of the Philippines was never fully conquered by the Japanese. And many of the members of the Philippine Army and some of the U.S. Army men as well remained unsurrendered, particularly in the Visayas and Mindanao. Others were political leaders who did not want to bow to the Japanese. Others were young men, boys, girls who also did not want to stay under Japanese rule and instead joined the guerrilla resistance movement. Others were simply ordinary civilians who chose to get out of Japanese occupied areas and joined the underground resistance movement in the mountains. Others would join the resistance movement by remaining in the cities and towns, but acting as intelligence agents for the guerrilla resistance movement. The resistance movement was spontaneous. It was nationwide. The poster that we see on the left side was something that was mounted in Iloilo before the Japanese came in. The Japanese found this and others posted all over Iloilo. The right side is a leaflet that was circulated in mid-1942, right under the Japanese noses in Manila. We have people from the mountain provinces coming in, people from all parts of the Philippines coming in using their native clothing, using whatever they had, but joining up and organizing guerrilla forces. So organized would it be later on that once MacArthur established contact with some of the units, he tried to organize it the same way that the Philippine Army had been organized before the war. There were, of course, major problems such as organization. What type of organization? Would it be military organization or would it be modified? Who would lead? There was a lack of weapons. There was always the problem of Japanese raids and spies. The Kempeitai or the military police might capture these leaders or some of the intelligence agents and would torture them. Many people were killed without divulging the names of their friends or their accomplices in the resistance movement. But some areas managed to unify themselves quite well. Some areas in the Visayas and large parts of Mindanao managed to remain outside Japanese rule. And after establishing contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, would begin organizing in a more professional manner. There would be women guerrilla leaders. There were also Chinese guerrilla units. There were even some foreigners who were involved. Basques, Free French, Poles, Australians, different nationalities were also involved in these guerrilla units. Naturally, Americans were involved too. Some of them were granted recognition by MacArthur's headquarters in Mindanao, in Australia. And once that contact was established, submarines were sent to the Philippines bringing weapons, propaganda items, equipment, various other materials that the guerrillas needed. So these were called guerrilla submarines. Now, for every guerrilla attack on the Japanese launched a ferocious counterattack, and that resulted in the destruction of many towns. And so MacArthur would issue what became known as lie low orders to many of the guerrilla units to prevent the civilian towns and organizations from being hit by the Japanese. That became controversial. It's still controversial to this day. Women were very active in the resistance movement. These are just some of them who were involved in it. Some of them looked like this, were in rags, uh, dressed in whatever they had. Many of them were barefoot, actually. This is one of the guerrilla submarines, one of the largest ones that returned to the Philippines many times, bringing a lot of equipment and weapons to the Filipino guerrillas. And of course, they would bring in propaganda material with MacArthur's face on it and his immortal "I shall return" slogan. It's that buoyed many of the guerrilla units, although others did not even need this to continue fighting for what they believed in. On the left side, we see two pictures of guerrillas after having received weapons from these guerrilla submarines. So several guerrilla successes took place. Many of these are not recorded in our textbooks or in our general histories of the war. There were many important ambushes and several successful sabotage missions. The most senior Japanese army officer who was ambushed by a guerrilla unit was no other than General Tanaka, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese army in the Philippines in 1943. His entourage was attacked and ambushed in Iloilo in 1943. Tanaka himself was not hit, but his aide-de-camp and his close-in escorts were hit and wounded, and that caused him to suffer that caused him to become very depressed after that. After the ambush, he was silently returned to Japan and replaced by another officer. Perhaps the most important success by guerrillas in the Philippines was the capture by Filipino guerrillas in Cebu of the top secret Japanese Navy war plans when the Japanese plane crashed off Cebu, bringing with it the top-ranking officials of the Japanese Navy. They were rescued by the guerrillas, and the satchel containing these plans was also recovered. And that was brought to Australia, translated, and brought to Pearl Harbor, where it was made of good use in the next naval battle. The guerrillas kept up morale, especially in the occupied areas, to show that the guerrillas were still fighting, that the Philippines had not been conquered. There were guerrilla propaganda sheets, there were newspapers that reported what was going on outside to circumvent the Japanese censorship. Some towns and cities were actually recaptured by guerrillas. Dept, for example, was recaptured by guerrillas under Wenceslao Vinsons. The Japanese recaptured it after some time, but that was a morale-boosting event, the capture of Dept. The same thing was done in Mindanao when Mindanao guerrillas, Muslim guerrillas in particular, led an assault on Balay and other Japanese strongholds in Mindanao. There was also a great deal of disruption of Japanese military transportation and communications. And in the more or less stabilized free areas, a civil government was actually established. And to counter the Mickey Mouse money, you have guerrilla currency being circulated in the guerrilla areas. So these are examples of some of the guerrilla currency that was actually being used in Negros, in Iloilo, in Mindanao. In the right side, you see a guerrilla newspaper that was circulated in the Negros area in 1943. In Mindanao, you even had a postal service using specially minted stamps like this for the guerrillas. This is Pendatun and Kabili in Mindanao. They were the leaders of a joint Christian-Muslim force in Lanao and Bukidnon. And one important thing that the guerrillas did was to watch over Japanese ship movements in what was called the Coast Watchers. The Coast Watchers provided very up-to-date information on how many ships, what types, how fast, and where they were going. They were reporting these to MacArthur's headquarters and to the Navy, and U.S. Navy submarines used this information to great effect. Sometimes the Coast Watchers would report a convoy that they saw, and in a few hours would see that convoy being attacked by American submarines. So Filipinos in the States were also involved in the fighting. Many of the young Filipino men volunteered to join the U.S. Army. They became part of the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment, and they were eventually sent. Some of them were sent to Australia, where they were sent to the Philippines by submarine to help further train the guerrilla resistance movement. This was the unit insignia of the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment that eventually wound up in Australia and New Guinea, then up to Leyte. So finally, we come to the liberation campaigns. It was a matter of time that the Americans would come back. The Japanese did not have the economic resources for a long war, and we knew that, and the Americans definitely knew that. And so by August and September of 1944, you would have American planes again appearing over Philippine skies. In case of Manila, the first air raid would take place here on September 21. That was any of these particular air raids were causes of rejoicing when the new American planes with the blue and white emblems of the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army show up appearing on Philippine skies. These resulted in many Filipinos climbing trees or running out into the streets to welcome these American planes, not knowing that the bombs and bullets would not choose the victims. Ironically, some of the damage in Manila at this time was caused by Japanese anti-aircraft shells, which missed their targets and landed back on the Philippines, landed back on buildings in the Philippines. So the Americans initially planned to land in Mindanao, realizing that the guerrillas had given intelligence that the Japanese were not that weak in other parts of the Philippines. The timetable was advanced, and from Mindanao, the Americans would decide to land in Leyte instead. And the Leyte landings, I think we are familiar with that. That would result in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese would realize that if any part of the Philippines was taken by the Americans, this would cut their supply lines, and that would be the end of the war for them economically. The oil that they were taking from the Indonesia area, the rubber from the Malay Peninsula, and so forth, and the materials that they needed in the Philippines, all of that would be cut if any part of the Philippines was lost. So the Japanese sent everything they could, the last remaining warships of the Imperial Navy, all their planes, some of their troops, even from Manchuria and from China and even mainland Japan, were sent to Leyte to try to contest that. Eventually, the battle was lost by the Japanese, and the Americans moved on to Mindoro, Lingayen, move on to Batangas, and so forth, and finally into Manila. And General Yamashita's defense strategy at this point was, by the end of the 1944, was no longer to defend the whole Philippines, but go up into the mountains and try to drag the Americans there as long as possible. So much of the fighting would take place later on in places like Dalton Pass, Besang Pass, and so forth. And you would have fighting going on in the Visayas and Mindanao as well. So the Japanese would try to counter all of the American raids by saying that the Americans were always losing. This was a propaganda bust that they had, saying the Americans were heavily beaten. But there were other sources of information that showed that this was really patently false. And MacArthur returned, as we know, on October 20. By this time, he would order the guerrillas to rise and strike the Japanese. And the civil government, the Commonwealth government, would be brought back to the Philippines. Quezon had died by this time, but here we see behind MacArthur, President Osmeña. And again, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was something very crucial to the Japanese. They could not afford to lose any part of the Philippines, so they sent everything, including the largest battleships that they had, the Yamato and the Musashi. The Musashi was sunk in Philippine waters, where she still lies today. After that was one invasion after another. These are various areas showing on the left two pictures in the Leyte area, but on the right side you have it's Zambales and the other is in the Sulu area. And we might mention that the Battle for Manila is one of those important events during the war, lasting for 1 month, beginning February 3, 1945. Rather than heed Yamashita's orders to leave Manila and fight in the mountains, the naval commander of Manila, Admiral Iwabuchi, would decide to stay and fight and converted many of the buildings from Intramuros in southern Manila into fortifications. Northern Manila, he would order burned. So we see Rizal Avenue here after the big fire that the Japanese units set to try to delay the American advance. On the right side, we see a very famous photograph, a tank entering Fort Santiago, one of the final bastions of Japanese defense in Intramuros. Again, here there were cases of heroism. One looks at the tragic side of it, but almost always there was a heroic side in it. So even as the fighting was going on in parts of Manila, you would have here a Filipino nurse and trying to bring a casualty from Philippine General Hospital across Taft Avenue to the Philippine Women's University area. What's interesting about this is no more ambulances, so they have to use a cariton. And the nurse that we see here actually has more behind her than simply having been a nurse in PGH at that time. She was one of the Filipino nurses who also served in Bataan, and she had been returned to Manila after the fall of Bataan, resumed her duties as a nurse in Philippine General Hospital. So she was a heroine in Bataan, and here she is again, a heroine in the Battle of Manila. The guerrillas had many victories, supporting the American assault on Los Baños internment camp, fighting in Manila, leading the American forces to the University of Santo Tomas to help liberate the camp, and in far-flung places like Besang Pass, which was a Filipino guerrilla victory. So finally, the war ended, and the end of the war, for many, the war would have ended once the fighting ended. So Manila, the fighting officially ended on March 3. That would have been the main end of the war. Baguio would have been liberated by late April 1945, and the other cities in the Visayas and Mindanao would have their own liberation dates, April, May, June, and so forth. But still, the war was going on, and in fact, one whole division of Philippine troops was being prepared to land in Japan if the atomic bombs had not been dropped. And so they were training to fight on Japanese soil, but the atomic bombs were dropped. The war ended very suddenly, and this is what it looked like in Manila when news came that the Japanese had finally accepted the surrender terms of the Allies. So with that, a great deal of happiness, a great deal of excitement that the war was now over. The formal surrender of Japanese units in the Philippines took place in Baguio, but there were many local surrenders that took place even before this. And what is ironic is that during this formal surrender ceremony, which marked the official end of the fighting in the Philippines, there were no Filipino representatives here. But you have the British commander of Singapore was here, and General Wainwright was here, and various commanders of the U.S. Army forces were there too. Now, summing up, the cost and legacy of the war was we lost 1.1 million lives out of 17 million. Our population in 1943 was between 17 and 18 million people. So out of that 17 million, 1.1 million died, either directly because of combat or warfare, or because of wounds, or because of disease or malnutrition. So that means 1 out of 17 Filipinos died as a result of the war. Some of them were our most brilliant people, Jose Abad Santos, for example, General Lim, and others. The others were just Filipinos from all walks of life, Muslims, peoples from the mountain areas, indigenous peoples. They all paid for their lives in this war. And they fought, many of them fought in the belief that they were fighting for the defense of the country and for what they believed in. Physical destruction was very difficult to calculate. So much was lost in terms of buildings, bridges, infrastructure. And in addition to that, historical and cultural treasures were lost as well. And the pre-war peace and order that we had, that was lost in after World War II as well. And there were many moral issues that came about after the war that divided the people. Collaboration, crimes related to the war, people who took advantage of the others, demoralization because the government was so weak after the war. But to offset all of that negative effort, all the negative issues there, was a great deal of heroism too. So many people died, but they died heroically without giving up the names of their colleagues and their guerrilla friends. Others considered simply surviving the war as a source of pride. And so after the war, you have this mixed legacy, a lot of death, a lot of destruction, but also a sense of pride in having been able to endure this, in being able to survive this extreme difficulty. And with that, we can bring ourselves back to the present. We are under extreme difficulty at present. Those who endured the war, at least those I interviewed way back 40 years ago, would always tell me we are a strong people. We are going to be able to survive whatever happens. And so let me conclude by saying that while there was all the tragic cost of the war, 1.1 million lives lost, there were the heroes that we have. And we commemorate our heroes through memorials, through books, through publications, through documentaries, but especially in this particular way. The 1,000 peso bill that has the faces of three of our very important heroes, Jose Abad Santos, Jose Fallanes Escoda, and General Vicente Lim. The three of them only represent the larger bulk of those Filipinos who were heroes of the Second World War. All three of these gave up their lives for the Philippines. They gave up their lives for the cause they believed in. They all represented different sectors of Philippine society. Jose Fallanes Escoda representing the women, representing civic society. Jose Abad Santos representing the government. Vicente Lim representing the military, but also representing the Filipino-Chinese sector. So all of them are the tip of the iceberg of the Filipinos who endured World War II. And as we look back 80 years from the time that all this happened, we look back and see that if we could be strong at that time, then we can also be strong this time. And therefore, there are lessons in survival, there are lessons in heroism that are still applicable to the present day. So with this, thank you very much for listening, and good evening.
Hi, Robin. Hope you're doing good. There's fires there in Colorado. Hope your family's well. We also have Mr. Andrew Jones from Rhode Island, USA, who is taking up his master's in World War II history. There's also Sito Maramba from UK. Hi, Sito. Sito has a lot of nuggets of knowledge. Sito kanina said, Sir Rico, that kangkong was also widely grown during the war. As part of the substitutes, perhaps, no? So we'll start with some of the questions here. Hold on, from Mr. Sorry, I screenshotted some of them para easier. Hold on. Some comments muna from Yan Villaver. I didn't know who the speaker was, but hearing his voice, I know already. Kasaysayan 111. Kasaysayan 115. Dr. Ricardo Jose, hi sir. This is so funny. All right. There's a question from Dr. Blas Bermudez. Who was at fault when the Japanese was able to wipe out the majority of the US warplanes in the ground at the start of the war? Siguro po to, sir. Is it true that some say it was MacArthur's fault? This was in Clark Field po, no, sir?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah. That's actually still very controversial today. It's not fully been, the blame has never really been fully pinpointed because the records are missing. Some records that came up actually were doctored or they were written long after. So what seems to have happened is that the Air Force officer, General Brereton, wanted to attack Taiwan as soon as possible. And in fact, remember they had the B-17s, and that was the strongest. We had the strongest force of B-17s outside the US at that time. These could have been used, and General Brereton wanted to attack Taiwan right away, Japanese airfields there. MacArthur did not hear him. Whether it was MacArthur who said, no, we don't know, because Brereton would say it was the chief of staff who stopped him, who said, you cannot meet MacArthur. So was it Sutherland's fault? Was it MacArthur's fault? We'll never actually get to know why. What Brereton did was he sent the planes flying as soon as he heard about Pearl Harbor. So they took off when daylight came. So if the Japanese had actually attacked when they had originally planned to attack, the same time that Baguio and Davao were attacked, the planes would not have been there. So it was really a twist of fate. The main attack force that hit Clark Field was supposed to attack very early in the morning. And had that happened, the planes would not have been bombed on the ground. What happened was Taiwan, the Navy bombers were covered with fog. So they thought that they were delayed by 3 or 4 hours when they took off. And by the time they arrived in Clark Field, they felt, that's it, we have lost surprise. The Americans know we're coming. Well, that was also lunchtime. And after the planes had been flying for 3 hours or so, they had to land. They were low on gas. So they landed. And by that time, the orders were already coming, prepared to bomb Taiwan. Let's get ready. We'll send a reconnaissance plane first, and then we'll see what we can bomb. So unfortunately, it's when the planes were preparing for that bombing mission that they were bombed on the ground. So bad timing, delays on both sides. So it was really something that it's so hard. Who would you blame? Would you blame the fog? Would you blame MacArthur? It's a complex issue. Now I think there was something that came up a little earlier on also, that there was somebody had said that would it have been because MacArthur was considering Quezon's attempt to keep the Philippines neutral? But the Philippines had been bombed already. I think Davao had been bombed as early as 6 or 7 a.m. And Quezon himself saw the bombing of Camp John Hay. He was up there in Baguio. I saw that. So under those conditions, the Philippines could no longer become neutral.
I see. So, Rico, at the time the Japanese forces came, our B-17s were lined up like sitting ducks po, no? In
Yes,
Clark. Oh my. And
The other,
how many, there were a lot sent here na before the start of the war, right?
I think there was something like 35 of them.
Wow.
Now that was
35
the,
B-17s.
and there were more. No, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, if you know what happened in Pearl Harbor, there was a flight of B-17s that the Japanese actually saw coming in. Those were bound for the Philippines. So if Pearl Harbor was not bombed that day, they would have flown here. They were going to
Ah,
refuel in Hawaii, but
I
the
see.
war caught them there. So we had the largest number, but they did know that Clark might be bombed. So half of them were in Bukidnon. They were in Malaybalay. Or rather, they were in Del Monte airfield. So you'd say more than half of them were destroyed on the first day. But the uh, exposed nature of Clark Field plus the destruction of the facilities rendered Clark Field almost useless from day one.
Right. Uh-huh. Very sad, no? Decimated yung nasa Clark. And many of the initial targets of the Japanese were really airfields, no? So,
Yeah. Yes.
I read in relation to that, I read one of the books about MacArthur saying that MacArthur and Sutherland both swear that they told Brereton to act on it.
Yeah.
So, magulo na. I cannot really say who said, who's correct and ano.
Yeah.
Anyway, so many questions, Rico. Wait, let's check another one. Hold on. There's a very nice question about war reparations eh.
Yes.
Hold on. Asan na ba? Sandali lang po. Mahina ang kalaban. Ito na lang, sir. Maganda to. What is your position on the command responsibility verdict of Yamashita? So this has to do with his war crimes trials. So what daw po? This is a question from Mr. June Magno.
Yeah. At that time, they did not have the concept of command responsibility yet. In fact, the idea of war crimes was still something relatively new. The idea of war crimes was already raised in Germany a few months before. So they did have the war crimes trials in Germany. Now, in the case of Japan, in the case of the Philippines particularly, the person that they tended to focus on really, insofar as MacArthur was concerned, was Yamashita. And they used the principle of command responsibility. And so even if Yamashita would claim that he did not know all of these things happened, he was still in charge of them all. Now, the one thing that we see now is there has been a great move to try to look at Yamashita's point of view, that he had no communications with Manila or with even Montalban and so forth. His communications were very poor. And yet, actually, he did have good communications with some units, and he had good communications with Tokyo. So one of the things that he would use to defend himself during the trial was, one of the big cases against him was the rape of Manila. And he would say, I didn't know what happened in the Battle of Manila. He was in the dark. And yet his junior officer in Montalban knew what was happening then. And they were receiving news reports from Tokyo, which did report about the rape of Manila. And in fact, Spain would be so angered by what happened in Manila that they would break relations with Japan as a result of that. And Yamashita knew that. So for Yamashita to say that he did not know what was happening, that was he was not telling the truth there. So when you look at the transcript today, when I look at it, I'd say there are things that are still very inconsistent. One thing that we are unable to really unearth completely is when the Japanese headquarters in northern Luzon surrendered, they burned all their documents. So we will never ever see those radio logs and so forth. And when Tokyo decided to surrender also, they burned everything that was very controversial. Use of gas, biological, they burned all of that stuff. So in terms of, if you're a lawyer, you can say there's no evidence, but the evidence was destroyed. So I would say command responsibility, you look at it, was Yamashita guilty of all of these crimes? Perhaps he did not know of some, but he must have known of some of the others. I think there would be alternative sources, and he could have done something more at that particular point. So I think it was really time to pinpoint. What's strange is that what I cannot understand is why they did not hold the naval commander of the Philippines accountable, because it was an admiral who was in charge of Manila. That's Admiral Iwabuchi. If there was General Yamashita in charge of the Japanese army units, there was a naval commander in charge of the naval units here, and they were very, what would you say? They hardly cooperated with each other. Now, the naval commander, Admiral Okochi, actually testified against Yamashita for the prosecution, and they did not charge him. So there are still many questions about that trial.
Right. And so Rico, is it true that yung the Japanese army and the Japanese navy are always at odds with each other?
Very much so. That I think that cost them the war. They were making weapons that did not have exchangeable parts. They did not want to share. The Japanese Navy did not want to share submarines, so the Japanese Army came up with their own submarines and so forth. It was very counterproductive.
And in relation to the war crimes trials, ito naman, mapunta naman tayo kay General Homa. I remember reading during the trial, he said something like, this is for about the Bataan campaign. By around February, they were already undermanned and they were weak at that point. So marami nagre-react, many people react, why didn't the US USAFE, make a counter strike against the Japanese? Do you have any thoughts on this, Rico?
Yeah. In fact, General Lim wanted to launch a counterattack because they did have intelligence agents, and they did say the Japanese were quite weak at that particular point. And General Lim was one of those who was really advocating a counterattack, or at least breaking through the lines and going up into the mountains and fighting guerrilla war. General MacArthur refused to consider that because he believed, and I think he was sincere in this, that he felt aid was coming from the US, because Washington was always telling him that aid is coming. Now, there was some. It was going to Australia, but it could hardly reach the Philippines anymore. And MacArthur was led to believe that there was some form of assistance coming. So when he was ordered to Australia, he took that as a sign that we're going to lead the counterattack. And he was so shocked when he found out there was nothing there. So I think when he decided not to launch that counterattack, when he turned down General Lim's request, I think he said he trusted what Washington was saying, but he didn't know that there was no truth to what they were saying.
There was no men and material coming. And what would you say, Sir Rico, are the reasons why walang dumating, help didn't come?
Well, one was there were convoys already. In fact, remember the timetable that MacArthur had was he would be ready by March 1942. So had the war started a little later, even January or February, more of these ships would have arrived. And they were carrying anti-aircraft guns, they were carrying more weapons, they were carrying more American soldiers as well. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, that stopped all assistance coming in. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what the Japanese did also, they also very quickly attacked Davao, and they attacked Jolo. By capturing Jolo and Davao, that meant that the southern part of the Philippines was now cut off from anything coming from the south. Then after that, they moved into islands of present Indonesia, and that further cut the Philippines off. So even if supplies managed to get to Australia, they could only be sent by either small submarines or by cargo ships that had been hired to run the blockade. Many ships did try to run the blockade. Many of them were sunk. Oh. And submarines, what could they carry? And then the Australians felt we have to be defended. So and the Dutch felt send the reinforcements to Indonesia instead. because we don't have enough forces. So there were actually U.S. Army forces that fought in Java.
Ah, I
Then they got
see.
captured. They got captured there also, but they were originally intended for the Philippines, but they couldn't make it.
Oh. See, ang dami pong matututunan talaga kay Dr. Jose. Anyway, Dr. Jose, here, another very interesting question. Marami nagtatanong parati nito. Did Japan pay war reparations and did they officially ask for forgiveness? This is a question from Mr. Wilbur D.
Okay, so the second answer first, they never did. They never did apologize for the war. Insofar as reparations money was concerned, they did pay some, but it was a very much watered down amount. We calculated something like $8 billion at that time, which included lives lost and all the infrastructure lost. And the Japanese wound up actually paying us a little less than 1/10 of that, and not even in cash. It was paid for in kind and in services. Only a fraction of that was paid for in cash. And it was a government-to-government transaction, so none of the individuals who would file war claims would get anything. So
yes. There's another question here, medyo related dyan, Sir Rico, on the surplus. The surplus, hold on, I'm looking for it. What were your thoughts about, us being paid with the surplus army equipment?
Okay, well, two things about this first. So the Japanese were supposed to pay the bulk of the war damage because they started the war. If they had not come to the Philippines, the war would not have taken place. So we placed a lot of reliance on reparations funding. The Americans would pay what was called rehabilitation money, and the rehabilitation funds would be essentially for government infrastructure, buildings, bridges. That's why they rebuilt the legislative building, City Hall, Quezon Bridge. All these big bridges were rebuilt with American rehabilitation aid. But now the U.S. government by 1945-46 was no longer the same government of 1940, 1939. By 1939-1940, many senators and congressmen still knew about the Philippines, the Tidings McDuffie Act, the Commonwealth, and all of that. By 1945-46, the U.S. was in a different position, and the Philippines was not seen as that special relationship anymore. They were now looking at helping Britain, helping Europe get back to its feet, helping China get back to its feet. The Philippines was only part of this. So we were part of a large picture. And so, well, there was a fair amount of money that was allotted to rehabilitation funds. A lot of that would be channeled to the government, and the private claimants faced a very difficult time trying to get money for a car lost or a freezer or home appliances that were lost. Very difficult. Even today, many are unhappy with that. Now, in order to try to raise the amount of rehabilitation aid, the Americans had all of this surplus equipment in the Philippines. And so they turned that over to the Philippine government. Now, why was there all this surplus in the Philippines in the first place? Now, before the atomic bombs were dropped, and before the existence of the atomic bomb was known, the Allied forces were going to land in Japan. In fact, the plans to land in Japan were well underway. The schedule was there, November 1946 and so forth. And all of that stuff was coming in the Philippines. All the jeeps, all the landing craft, all the tanks, they were all assembling in the Philippines. All the guns, they were all assembling here. So when the atomic bomb ended all of that, all of this was surplus. The Americans didn't need it. They didn't want to bring that back. It would cost too much to bring them back to the States. So the jeeps, the trucks, the landing craft, they were turned over to the Philippine government. Some of them were sold as a private property. And this was part of rehabilitation. And that's why we wind up with a jeepney, because we had so many of these jeeps after the war. The 6x6 trucks became buses, initial buses. cargo vehicles.
So
they
the Marston
they calculated the amount of that, and they made, okay, this is part of the rehabilitation aid to the.
Very sad. This is a very, folks, this is a very wide topic. This deserves one episode at the least, no? So we have done this before. And kulang pati kahit 1 or 2 episodes. But we'll try our very best to invite Dr. Rico Jose again to talk about, the after the war, the immediate post-war years, reparation, rehabilitation, how were we able to rebuild? And this deserves really one episode. So folks, we don't have much time anymore. Thank you, Dr. Rico Jose, for this very insightful presentation. And thank you everyone for watching. But before we go, kanina, Sir Rico's last slide was about the 3 heroes in our 1,000 peso bill. You must probably all heard by now na it will be removed by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas and will be replaced by the Philippine Eagle. So to our staff, Roddy, can you please put the slide for the change.org petition? We'd like to ask everybody watching now to sana please sign the online petition campaign that we started. We started this December when BSP or Bangko Sentral released their statement saying that the Philippine Eagle will replace the 3 heroes. Though how majestic and the Philippine Eagle is, it cannot replace the value of the 3 heroes. So let our voices be heard. Save our heroes. So please, guys, go to change.org. Look for the petition saying no to the removal of our World War II heroes. And please sign and share. We need more signatures so that we can lodge this to BSP and let them know that the overwhelming majority of the Filipino people do not want our heroes removed from the bill. So again, change.org. Please sign and share po. Thank you very much. And some announcement for our next lecture. Our guest will be Mr. Hampton Sides. He is the author of Ghost Soldiers. And kung napanood niyo yung The Great Raid, starring Cesar Montano. So he was one of the consultants there, because it was loosely based on his book. And he has written a lot of books as well, but this is the one which really, talked about the Philippine World War II experience. And this is actually one of the books that got me really, really interested in Philippine World War II history. So I have told Hampton many times that, you're the reason why I'm here. So the date might change. Please, we'll update you. The date might change because he's writing a book now and has to go to Hawaii for some time. So we might move it to a later date, but we'll keep you posted. We'll post updates in our Facebook page. Please like our Facebook page, Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, so you'll get updates. This lecture series will be a year-long event. So we're striving to have at least one lecture per month, inviting, important historians, authors, and experts on World War II history as commemoration, because this year is the 80th anniversary of the fall of Bataan, Corregidor, the occupation of Manila. As you have heard from Dr. Jose's lecture, for me, I think this is the 3.5, longest, darkest, and most tumultuous years in our history. So, ito po, we bring you this educational lecture series so that you can learn more about our World War II history. And this is brought to you by Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation, Filipino-American Memorial Endowment, or FAME. FAME is the organization responsible for putting up all those 138 Bataan Death March markers on the road that you see. Di ba po, coming from Bataan all the way to Tarlac, you see these kilometer markers. So this was put up by FAME in the 1990s. No? Hindi po siya government project, kundi private project po yan ng Filipino-American Memorial Endowment. So ito po pagpupugay sa ating mga veterano at mga sundalo at mga resistance fighters, who gave up their lives. And wag natin kalimutan mag-sign po, Save Our Heroes. And we'll have more. By February, we'll have James Scott to talk about the Battle of Manila. March, we'll have Cecilia Garland of Bataan Legacy Historical Society, and many, many more. We'll announce updates in our Facebook page. So this is Desiree Benipayo from the Philippine World War II Memorial Foundation. Thank you, Dr. Jose. Thank you to all our viewers. And we hope to see you on our next episode. Thank you, good night, and stay safe.